when three wealthy young men hurled a food tray onto Nolan Reed. The quiet single father simply wiped his shirt and told them to stop disturbing the other customers. The entire diner laughed at his silence, not one person aware that Nolan had once been a Marine Gunnery Sergeant who led 12 fellow soldiers home from a mission no one expected to survive. Then the front door swung open. 20 veterans stepped inside, and every one of them snapped to attention before him. And the ringleader, standing with his friends, began to understand that his father had been hiding a secret for 16 long years. If you believe that self-respect is stronger than humiliation, stay close as Nolan's buried secret finally comes into the light. Nolan Reed arrived at Dorsey's diner just before 7 in the morning, the same way he had arrived every weekday for the past 4 years, ever since his wife had passed and Marlene Dorsey had quietly stepped into the empty space she left behind. The booth by the window was always kept open for him, not because anyone asked, but because Marlene understood that some routines were not about coffee or eggs, but about the small dignities a grieving man builds for himself after everything else is gone. Nolan was finishing a call with his daughter Hadley, reminding her of a registration deadline, when the door opened and 3 young men stepped inside with the kind of noise that fills a room before it has earned any right to. They wore expensive clothing and carried the casual certainty of people who had never once been asked to leave anywhere. And one of them raised a phone to film the interior of the diner with the detached amusement of someone cataloging something old and slightly embarrassing. The other 2 drifted toward the counter, laughing at the handwritten specials board, loudly debating whether the linoleum was original or simply looked that way. A woman named Clara, who had worked at Dorsey's for 11 years, came out from behind the counter with a damp cloth and was met immediately by the sound of a glass being knocked over, not accidentally, not by wind or carelessness, but with the particular slowness of someone who wanted to see what would happen next. Clara knelt to clean the spill without a word, and one of the young men held his phone directly above her, tilting his head the way a person does when they find something ordinary and humiliating to be uniquely compelling. Nolan set down his mug and asked, without raising his voice, that they put the phone away and show some basic respect for the woman cleaning a mess they had made. The tallest of the 3, Preston Whitmore, 19 years old, wearing a jacket that cost more than Clara earned in a month, turned slowly and looked at Nolan the way someone looks at a misplaced piece of furniture. He recognized Nolan from a company badge photograph, identified him as a mid-level inspector at his father's facility, and seemed to find the entire situation amusing in a way that required no further analysis. Preston said that a man earning what Nolan earned had no business telling anyone bearing the Whitmore name how to behave, and his 2 companions, Logan Price and Ethan Cole, laughed in the particular way that group laughter works, which is to say entirely on cue. Nolan replied only that he was asking Preston to apologize to Clara, not to him, and not to anyone who was not currently on her knees cleaning a floor she had not dirtied. Logan said something about Nolan's age. Ethan added something about the condition of his jacket, and Preston let both observations hang in the air just long enough before he picked up the tray from the nearest table, the one holding Nolan's plate, his glass, and a small bowl of hot sauce, and emptied it directly onto Nolan's chest with a sharp, practiced motion. The diner went silent for perhaps 3 full seconds before it filled again with laughter and the sound of cameras clicking, and Clara pressed her hand to her mouth, and Marlene appeared from the kitchen doorway and stood very still. Nolan looked down at the stains spreading across his shirt, and then he bent and picked up the fallen glass from the floor, set it upright on the nearest surface, and righted the overturned chair beside him without haste, without trembling, and without looking at Preston at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the particular flatness of a man who has been in rooms far more dangerous than this one, and understands exactly how much energy is worth spending in each of them. He said, "You can stain this shirt, but don't let one foolish minute ruin the rest of your life." Preston laughed because he believed that Nolan was frightened of what his family could do to him, and he was still laughing when the front door opened and 20 people who had once served in the United States Marine Corps walked into Dorsey's diner for a reunion that Marlene had quietly arranged months in advance. The moment Silas Boone, wide-shouldered, gray at the temples, with the bearing of a man who has spent decades deciding things quickly, saw Nolan standing in the middle of that diner with food on his shirt and the remains of a plate on the floor, he stopped walking. The 19 people behind him stopped as well, and then, without a word being exchanged, every one of them stood upright and still in a gesture that needed no explanation for anyone who had ever worn a uniform. Silas looked across the room at Preston, and his voice was neither loud nor cruel when he said, "You just threw food on the man who brought all of us home." Preston Whitmore had grown up hearing the name Whitmore attached to achievement, legacy, and a version of military service that involved framed photographs and keynote speeches at charity dinners, and nothing in that upbringing had prepared him for the particular silence that fell over Dorsey's diner in the minutes that followed. The veterans made their way to Nolan one by one, some gripping his hand with both of theirs, some simply nodding with the gravity of men who know that certain debts cannot be repaid, only acknowledged in whatever small ways are available. A man named Donovan, who walked with a slight lean from a leg that had not healed cleanly, produced a folded topographic map from inside his coat and held it up briefly so that Nolan could see it, the same map, creased down to translucency at its folds, that Nolan had used to navigate a sector the official route had failed 16 years before. Logan and Ethan moved toward the door with the instinct of people who sense a social atmosphere shifting beyond their control, but Preston stood still, watching in the way that a person watches when something refuses to fit inside the category they had assigned it. Marlene came out from the kitchen and stood beside Silas, and she told him that she had spent 3 months coordinating the reunion without Nolan's knowledge, because every time anyone had tried to honor him in the years since he left the service, he had found a polite way to make the event about something else. Nolan had never worn his decorations to work, had never mentioned his record in a job interview, had submitted no application to veterans organizations that might have publicized his name, and had on at least 2 occasions stepped out of rooms where someone began describing his service in terms too large for the events as he remembered them. Nolan asked Silas quietly to keep the gathering calm and not to make Preston and his companions feel cornered, because he believed that a young man who had acted out of entitlement and ignorance needed to face consequences, not intimidation, and those were different things with different outcomes. Meanwhile, a customer at a nearby table had been filming since before the tray was thrown, and the footage, clean, uncut, showing the entire sequence of events, had already begun moving through the connected world. Preston noticed something lying near the end of the nearest table, where Nolan's belongings had been collected. A small metal badge, tarnished and scratched, bearing an emblem he had seen before without ever knowing where. He had seen it in a photograph his father kept locked in a private drawer, A photograph of men in uniform standing in terrain that suggested somewhere dry and far away, and in that photograph, one face had been cut away from the frame with scissors, not torn, but cut, as if the removal had been a deliberate act rather than an accident of time. Preston picked up the badge and turned it over, and the emblem on the reverse matched the one he had spent years trying to ask about, and had always been redirected from asking, and the connection he made in that moment was not a pleasant one. He excused himself and stepped outside to call his father, and when Reginald Whitmore answered and heard what Preston was describing, his response was not surprise or confusion, but something sharp and immediate and unmistakably afraid. Reginald told Preston to leave the diner at once, to say nothing to anyone, and under no circumstances to allow his name, or the name of the man, with the food on his shirt, to appear together within earshot of any journalist. Preston asked why a man his father had hired at a manufacturing plant would require that level of precaution, and Reginald said only that some situations had histories that could not be explained quickly, and that Preston needed to trust him. The instruction itself was the answer Preston had not known he was looking for, because a father with nothing to hide would not need his son to disappear from a breakfast. Nolan returned to the Whitmore Defense Systems facility later that morning, as if the previous 2 hours were something he was prepared to process in his own time, and found that his access badge had been deactivated at the security gate. A human resources representative called his cell phone to inform him that he had been suspended pending an investigation into alleged threatening behavior directed at a member of the CEO's immediate family, and Nolan stood in the parking lot and listened to the full statement without interrupting. That evening, a message arrived from a private number, 4 lines long and unmistakably deliberate. "I've kept your secret for 16 years. Don't make me tell my version." The footage moved through the connected world with the momentum that honest images tend to carry when they show something clear, and, for the first 48 hours, the consensus was straightforward. A young man from a wealthy family had publicly humiliated a quiet, middle-aged man, and then stood there while 20 veterans expressed, through the wordless discipline of standing at attention, exactly what kind of person that quiet man was. Whitmore Defense Systems moved quickly, because organizations built on reputation know that a narrative left uncontested will harden into fact. Within 72 hours, a second version of the footage appeared, shorter, beginning at a moment several minutes into the original, edited to suggest that Nolan had risen from his seat and moved toward Preston in a manner that could be described as aggressive before the tray had left Preston's hands. Anonymous accounts appeared across the connected spaces of the wider public sphere to describe Nolan as a man who had been quietly building a case against the Whitmore family for years, using his employment at the facility as cover, and the characterization was specific enough to feel researched, and general enough to be impossible to disprove quickly. A representative of Whitmore Defense called on Nolan with a document and a list that contained the following: his employment reinstated at an increased salary, all remaining tuition obligations for his daughter Hadley paid in full, a financial settlement described as generous by any reasonable measure, and a public statement from Nolan confirming that Preston had acted in reasonable response to a perceived threat. Nolan read the document with the unhurried attention he brought to every piece of paper placed before him on the job, and then he set it down and said that the moment the document mentioned his daughter's education, it had ceased to be a negotiation and had become something else entirely, and that Hadley was not a variable in any arrangement the Whitmore family wished to make. Silas called that afternoon, wanting to put visible, organized pressure on the Whitmore corporate headquarters. But Nolan asked him to wait, explaining that turning the matter into a confrontation between a group of veterans and a 19-year-old college student, however badly that student had behaved, would produce a story that distracted from the one that actually mattered. Evelyn Hart, who had practiced law for 18 years, after leaving her post as a legal officer in the Marine Corps, reviewed the unedited footage and the edited version and told Nolan plainly that he had standing to pursue legal action, and that the edited version had been constructed in a manner she found professionally offensive. But Nolan told her that the incident at the diner, as serious as it was, had become secondary to something he had been investigating before his access was revoked. In the 3 weeks before his suspension, he had identified 3 separate test cycles for a fire suppression system installed on specialized transport vehicles, systems that had failed the required performance threshold, and had traced those failures to a pattern of pressure applied by Facility Director Graham Pike, who had instructed the certification team to modify the test conditions until the equipment produced a passing result. Nolan had refused to sign the final certification, and the final certification had been signed anyway, using his digital account credentials, from a terminal he had not been at. Hadley drove down from her university on a Thursday and found her father at the kitchen table, with a plate he had not touched, still wearing the shirt from the diner, the stain visible in the fabric because he had not gotten around to addressing it. She asked him why he spent so much of his life standing between other people and harm, when no one ever seemed to return the gesture, and he said he did not want her watching her father become the center of a public dispute that dragged through press cycles for months, while people with nothing invested offered opinions. Hadley told him that what embarrassed her was not his past or his record or his quiet habits, but the simple fact that the people who had lied about him had come to believe he would continue allowing it, because he always had before. 2 days later, Evelyn called to say she had located the original mission report from 16 years prior, and that the officer listed in the section describing the rescue operation, the one who had reportedly organized the extraction of 12 stranded Marines from a compromised position, was not Nolan Reed. The mission had taken place in the dry heat of a foreign assignment during a period when Reginald Whitmore was a junior officer with the particular ambition of a young man who has planned his own career carefully and resents any development that falls outside that plan. The convoy route he selected had not been fully cleared by the forward reconnaissance team, a decision made in the name of time and efficiency, and the desire to deliver a clean performance record on what was supposed to be a routine resupply. When the lead vehicle suffered a mechanical failure and came to a stop in a sector flagged as uncertain, 12 Marines found themselves in a position that deteriorated faster than anyone standing at a map table would have predicted, and Reginald, assessing the situation with the calculation of a man measuring his options against what he wants to preserve, issued the order to withdraw the remaining vehicles and consolidate at the forward base. The order was tactically defensible in the narrow sense that it prioritized the larger force over the smaller one, and Reginald would spend years afterward describing it as the kind of painful decision that responsible command requires, though he would never describe it in any setting where the 12 men on the receiving end might be present. Nolan Reed, who held the rank of Gunnery Sergeant and whose job was to know the people under his responsibility the way a carpenter knows his tools, personally, specifically, and without illusion, told the driver beside him to turn the vehicle around. He brought 4 people with him, organized radio contact with the stranded group, directed field care for 2 men injured in the vehicle failure, and navigated a route back that avoided the sectors flagged as uncertain, using a method that combined the official map with notes he had made in a personal field journal during the previous week's movement. Every one of the 12 men came back. The mission report Nolan submitted afterward was accurate and complete, including the sequence of orders issued, the decision to return, and the outcome, and he believed the record spoke for itself and did not feel the need to speak for it. Reginald came to Nolan privately in the days following the debrief and asked him to consider the implications of a full public account, not for his own sake alone, he said, but for the unit, for the command structure, for the broader question of what a public investigation into an officer's judgment would do to the careers of every man who had been present. Nolan listened, filed his report as written, and did not speak to journalists, because he did not see himself as a person who required public credit for doing what his understanding of the job had required him to do. He assumed the record existed, was preserved, and would serve whatever purpose records serve. Months later, Nolan's wife was diagnosed with an illness that moved quickly and demanded everything he had, and he left the service and moved home and did not look at military paperwork again for years. By the time he stopped grieving long enough to look outward, Reginald Whitmore had become a figure in the defense industry, whose biography included a specific account of how he had organized the rescue of 12 Marines from a failed mission, and that account appeared in 2 published profiles, a university commencement speech, and the founding documents of a veterans scholarship fund. Evelyn examined the report she had obtained and found irregularities in the page sequencing, indicating that sections had been replaced rather than amended, that Nolan's name appeared in the witness attestation block, but was absent from the action narrative, and that the language in the revised sections carried stylistic markers inconsistent with the surrounding text. Silas and 10 other veterans who had been present offered to submit sworn statements, but sworn memories without documentary evidence presented a legal challenge that Evelyn described honestly as manageable but slow. Nolan retrieved the field journal from a box in his daughter's former bedroom closet, unwrapped it from the cloth he had stored it in, and opened it to the last page. Written in Reginald Whitmore's hand, in the deliberate block letters of a man composing something he intends to mean, "Reed, if we get home from this, I owe you everything." Nolan held the journal for a long time before he placed it on the table beside the other documents Evelyn had gathered, and what he felt was less triumph than exhaustion, the particular kind that comes from discovering that a thing you chose not to fight years ago has been growing in your absence. He could end Reginald Whitmore's public reputation with what was in that journal and what Silas and the others were willing to say, and he understood this with the clarity of a man who knows exactly what tools he is holding. But a stolen distinction from 16 years in the past, however genuine and however wrong, was not the thing keeping him awake at night, because the past had already happened, and the people involved had already lived through it. While the fire suppression systems that had failed 3 certification tests and been approved anyway were scheduled for installation on vehicles that real people would ride in, and that was a present tense problem with present tense consequences. He could pursue Reginald's history, or he could stop a shipment, and he had always been clearer about which problems demanded immediate attention. Before his suspension, Nolan had documented the certification failures with methodical attention. Dates, test parameters, measured performance against required threshold, the names of the technicians present, and the name of the supervisor who had instructed the team to rerun tests under modified conditions. The digital approval that appeared on the final certification form had been submitted from a logged terminal at a time Nolan could prove he was not in the building, because his building entry records showed him clocking out 40 minutes before the timestamp on the approval. Entry records that Whitmore's own security system had generated, and that Whitmore's own security system would have difficulty explaining away. Reginald's strategy, as Evelyn reconstructed it from the sequence of events, was built on a simple logic. If Nolan became publicly known as an unstable former serviceman with a personal grievance, any technical complaint he filed would arrive, preloaded with a motive that made it easy to dismiss. The edited footage from the diner was not a coincidence. It was a prepared instrument, which meant that someone had thought through the scenario before it concluded and had resources positioned to deploy. Evelyn told Nolan that he had anticipated this to some degree by sending copies of the test documentation to an independent auditing firm on the same day he refused to sign the certification, before his access was revoked and before anyone at Whitmore knew he had done so, and that those copies existed in a location entirely outside the reach of anyone at the company. Reginald summoned Preston to a private meeting and handed him a printed script. A prepared video statement in which Preston Mortels, a young man who had acted out of fear when a former employee approached him aggressively, a statement that contained no acknowledgement of Clara, no acknowledgement of the tray, and no mention of the veterans who had entered the diner afterward. Preston read the script with the expression of someone being asked to wear something that does not fit. Told his father he did not think the statement was accurate, and Reginald told him that accuracy was for depositions and that this was about managing a situation. Preston went home and thought about it for a day, and then went back to his father's private office when Reginald was not there. He found what he was looking for in the third drawer of the filing cabinet, the old photograph with its excised face, and beneath it a collection of correspondence, letters and cards addressed to Nolan Reed, care of the Whitmore Defense corporate address, received over more than a decade, opened, read, and filed without being forwarded. A letter from Silas described the night of the rescue in specific physical detail. The light, the temperature, the particular sound of the radio coming back to life, and what Nolan had said before he reversed the vehicle. In the upper right corner of this letter, written in red ink in Reginald's handwriting, were 4 words: "Do not release this." Below the correspondence, in a personnel folder labeled with Nolan's name, a directive signed by Reginald and dated 10 years prior, instructed that Nolan Reed was not to be considered for any supervisory or management position above his current classification, for reasons listed as administrative and left otherwise unexplained. The security camera at Dorsey's diner was positioned above the service counter, at an angle that produced a clear and complete record of everything that had happened from the moment Preston and his companions entered to the moment the veterans stood at attention. Marlene had reviewed the footage with Evelyn's guidance and confirmed that it showed, without ambiguity, that Nolan had not moved from his booth seat until after the tray had already been emptied onto him, that he had addressed Preston twice in a measured voice audible on the audio track, and that the sequence depicted in the edited version, circulating under anonymous authorship, was physically impossible given the timestamps. Marlene prepared a copy of the full recording on a portable drive and called Evelyn to arrange delivery. The call she received 2 days later was not from Evelyn, but from the management company holding the lease on the building where Dorsey's diner had operated for 22 years. informing her that the lease would not be renewed at its upcoming expiration, citing a portfolio restructuring decision made at the corporate level. Marlene knew what the building's ownership history looked like, because she had been through lease negotiations twice before, and she knew that the company now appearing on the renewal decision had not been listed in those negotiations, which meant it had acquired a financial interest in the property sometime in the weeks since the diner's footage had begun moving through the world. An associate of the new management company came by in person 2 days later to discuss the situation and mentioned, in the careful language of a man who has been briefed on what he is permitted to say, that previous owners of similarly situated properties had found the renewal process significantly more straightforward when certain logistical questions about surveillance equipment were resolved in advance. Marlene said no before the sentence was finished, and the associate left, and she sat down in one of her own booths and looked at the empty diner and felt the weight of 22 years in a single afternoon. Nolan came and sat across from her and told her he would not allow her to sacrifice what she had built for his benefit, and that there was a line between what he was willing to ask of the people who cared about him and what he was not. Silas and several veterans proposed buying the building outright through a collective fund, and Nolan objected to this as well, not because he did not understand the gesture, but because converting his friend's generosity into a financial instrument felt like it changed the nature of what they had, and he had spent enough of his life measuring what he owed people without wanting to add to the ledger. Evelyn traced the ownership chain on the building and found that the entity holding the lease control had acquired it 8 days after the footage first circulated, a timeline that demonstrated not only motivation but preparation, and she filed a formal complaint documenting the pattern as apparent witness intimidation, which gave the footage and Marlene's testimony a legal protection it had not previously carried. Silas, without announcing his intentions, had already created multiple copies of the original footage and distributed them to individuals whose possession of the material would be difficult for anyone to undo. And when Nolan found out, he was quietly grateful, in the way that people are grateful for help they specifically asked not to receive. Preston returned to the diner on a weeknight, alone after closing time, and Marlene met him at the door and told him she would not allow him inside until he had cleaned the table he and his companions had occupied on the morning in question. Preston, without argument, took the cloth she offered and cleaned the table. When Nolan arrived and found him waiting, Preston offered an apology, and then acknowledged that his original reason for coming had been to ask whether the footage could be managed, whether there was an arrangement that would make it disappear, and that somewhere between parking his car and cleaning a table, he had decided that the apology was the only part worth delivering. Nolan did not tell him it was acceptable, because it was not yet, but he asked Preston a question and then listened to the answer with the patience of a man who has decided that the quality of a person is not determined by their worst moment. Before Preston left, he pushed a folded photocopy across the table, a duplicate of the letter Silas had written, with his father's 4-word notation in the corner, and then said, "My father is planning a veterans gala. He's going to put you on that stage and use it to make you look like the problem." The event was called Honor and Service, and Reginald Whitmore's team had spent 6 weeks preparing it with the thoroughness that organizations apply to appearances when they know the appearances are at risk. The venue was a renovated maritime hall with the kind of architectural authority that makes printed photographs look important, The guest list included 2 state officials, a documentary filmmaker covering military history, and representatives from 4 veterans organizations whose endorsements appeared in the printed program. The invitation to Nolan was formal and public, issued through a spokesperson rather than any direct communication, and Reginald had calculated correctly that refusing it would be interpreted as evidence of the instability his team had been suggesting, while attending in anger would confirm it. Nolan told Evelyn that he planned to attend alone and that he had one request for the 20 veterans who wanted to come with him: civilian clothing, no coordinated arrival, and no demonstration of any kind, because he was not going to turn a defense industry fundraiser into a display of force. Reginald took the stage with the ease of a man who has given this speech in one form or another for 16 years and knows its rhythms the way a musician knows a piece played too many times to feel nervous about. He described his military service in the language of duty and sacrifice, pausing at appropriate moments, lowering his voice at the correct emotional registers, and on the large screen behind him appeared a photograph of a unit standing in bright foreign light, a photograph that had been selected specifically because it was one from which Nolan had already been removed. Reginald described a moment of command decision, a moment of darkness and risk, a moment of bringing his people home, and the room listened with the attentiveness rooms bring to stories they cannot independently verify. Then Reginald invited Preston to the stage, and Preston walked up with the expression of a person navigating terrain he has only partially scouted, and began reading from a statement placed on the lectern in advance. And the first 3 sentences proceeded according to the prepared text: an acknowledgement that his behavior had fallen below the standard his family represented, an expression of regret for any distress caused, a commitment to personal growth of the nonspecific variety that statements of this kind typically contain. Then Preston looked up and found Nolan sitting at a table near the back of the hall, not present, not waiting, simply present, and stopped reading. He put the paper face down on the lectern, and in his own words, without preparation, described exactly what had happened in the diner. His own motivations, the filming, the deliberate humiliation of Clara and the tray. He then said that his father's communications team had provided him with a different description of those events and had asked him to deliver it publicly, and the hall produced a sound that is difficult to categorize, not quite a gasp, not quite a murmur, something between the two that indicates a room recalibrating its understanding of what it is witnessing. Reginald moved to regain the stage, invoking Nolan's disciplinary record, characterizing the veterans in the room as participants in an organized effort to destabilize a company serving national defense, and demanding that Graham Pike stand and confirm that all production certifications were in compliance. Graham stood and confirmed, as he had been prepared to do, and Nolan, by this point standing at the side of the room, stated calmly in a carrying voice that the certification timestamps told a story that Graham's confirmation could not overwrite, and that he was prepared to present those timestamps to anyone in the room holding a governance position at Whitmore Defense. Genevieve Ashford, who chaired the board of Whitmore Defense and had come to the gala for reasons Reginald believed were social, listened to the timestamp statement with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and then asked for the event to pause. Evelyn, standing near the side entrance, received a message on her phone from the independent auditing firm. A fire suppression unit that had failed its performance threshold was scheduled for final shipment at 6 the following morning, and the window was 11 hours. Silas Boone stood up before the security staff reached Nolan's side of the room, and he said his name, his rank at discharge, and the position he had occupied in the convoy on the day in question 16 years before, the way a person states evidence rather than an argument. He said that he was one of 12 Marines whose vehicle had failed in an unsecured sector, that an order had been given to withdraw and leave them, and that the only reason he was standing in that hall rather than his name on a memorial was that Nolan Reed had chosen to return. 11 other people rose from different seats around the room, distributed as if by plan, though the plan had been only that each of them had come and chosen their own chairs, and they did not perform their testimony. They simply stood, and each one said what they knew to be true from where they had been standing when it happened. What the radio said, what they saw, what Nolan's voice sounded like coming through the static. What it meant to see the vehicles returning through the dust when they had been given no reason to expect them. A woman named Carol, who had been a field medic and now ran a physical therapy practice, described the specific injuries she had treated that night and the sequence in which Nolan had directed her attention to them, speaking with the measured precision of someone who has spent 2 decades being professionally responsible for accuracy. A man named Wallace, who taught history at a community college and had the demeanor of a person used to being questioned on sources, held up a journal of his own, kept independently, separate from Nolan's, and offered it as corroborating documentation of timeline and sequence. Evelyn approached Genevieve Ashford's table and placed a printed summary in front of her. The original test results, the timestamps of the modified approvals, the entry records showing Nolan's departure from the facility before his account was used, and the email chain in which Graham Pike had been instructed, in language that left little interpretive room, to ensure the documentation reflected the contract timeline rather than the actual performance results. Genevieve read the summary in the unhurried way of a person who does not need to perform comprehension for an audience, and then she asked Reginald a direct question about the certification timestamps. Reginald said he would address procedural questions through the appropriate internal channels, and Genevieve said she would prefer he addressed them now. Graham Pike, standing near the edge of the stage looking at a middle distance that contained nothing useful, was asked by Genevieve to confirm the accuracy of the summary Evelyn had provided, and Graham did something Reginald had not prepared for. He sat down and said nothing at all. Preston crossed the room to where Evelyn stood and handed her a portable storage device, with telling her it contained a copy of an email he had found in his father's office, that he understood what providing it meant, and that he was providing it anyway. Reginald turned to his son with an expression that had moved past anger into something colder, and said that Preston was throwing away everything the Whitmore name had built. Preston said that he had spent the last 2 weeks learning what the Whitmore name had actually been built on, and that the information had significantly changed his relationship to it. Genevieve informed the room that the board would convene an emergency session at 7 the following morning, that all shipments from the Whitmore Defense Production Facility were suspended pending review effective immediately, and that Reginald's executive authority was placed in administrative hold. Nolan spent the hours between midnight and 5 in the morning at a table in Evelyn's office with 2 auditors from the independent firm, going through the documentation with the systematic patience he had always brought to the mechanics of verification, not looking for what he wanted to find, but checking what was there against what should be there, and recording the discrepancy wherever it appeared. The fire suppression issue had been suspended, but suspension was not resolution, and there were contracts behind this contract facilities behind this facility, and a pattern of approved exceptions that extended further back than the 3 test cycles he had personally witnessed. The external audit copies he had transmitted weeks earlier, combined with the material Preston had provided and the documents Evelyn had obtained through legal process, were sufficient to construct a timeline that was, as one of the auditors observed without particular drama, not ambiguous in its implications. Graham Pike arrived at the board session with the expression of a man who has spent the night running the arithmetic on his own situation and has arrived at an answer he finds uncomfortable. He had been promised a promotion. The promotion had not been formalized. Formalized promises exist in writing, and verbal assurances are only as durable as the person who made them, and the person who had made them was sitting at the far end of the table, with his executive authority suspended and the board chair watching him with focused attention. Nolan was not adversarial with Graham. He placed a printed list on the table containing the names of 6 engineers who had filed internal objections to the certification process, objections that had been routed away from the official record, and asked Graham whether those individuals should be permitted to carry the consequence of a decision they had opposed in writing before it was made. Graham looked at the list for a long time, asked whether cooperation would be considered in the formal resolution of his own liability, and Evelyn said that it would be a factor for the relevant authorities to consider, and Graham then described the sequence of instructions he had received, the manner in which he had carried them out, and the dates on which each step had occurred. Reginald made a final attempt to redirect the session toward Nolan's military record. The official notation of insubordination, the departure from the service, a characterization of Nolan as a man who had spent years constructing a grievance, and Nolan waited until Reginald had finished before he spoke. He said that on one occasion in his military career he had refused an order to withdraw and leave 12 people in a compromised position, and that the 12 people had come home, and that he was not prepared to defend that decision because it had not required defending then, and it did not require defending now. He said that what he had refused to approve at the production facility was a fire suppression certification for a system that failed under controlled test conditions, that his reason was that the systems would be used by real people in real conditions that were not controlled, and that he would refuse again under the same circumstances and could not imagine a version of himself that would not. Genevieve called the session to a vote. The board voted to remove Reginald Whitmore from the chief executive position and suspend his operational authority pending full investigation, and the fire suppression contract was placed under immediate hold. Nolan then told Genevieve that before he addressed anyone outside, he wanted to speak to the employees of the facility, specifically to the people who had raised objections internally and had those objections buried, because they deserved to hear directly that their documents had been recovered and their names were on the right side of the record. 3 months passed, and in those 3 months the independent investigation concluded that falsified certification data extended across 7 product lines and 4 fiscal years, that the pattern had been deliberate and directed from the executive level, and that the 6 engineers whose objections had been buried were formally cleared and reinstated with back compensation for the professional consequences they had absorbed while trying to do what Nolan had eventually done publicly. The fire suppression systems under the problematic contract were recalled and replaced before deployment, which meant that the specific harm Nolan had spent weeks trying to prevent did not occur. And he received that news with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has been working toward a specific outcome and can now confirm it was reached. Reginald Whitmore did not face his final accounting in a courtroom that autumn, because legal proceedings of this complexity do not resolve on narrative timelines. But he did face the experience of watching the name he had spent 16 years building stripped from the headquarters building he had personally selected, by order of a board he no longer controlled, on a Tuesday morning when the light was flat and the street was mostly empty. Genevieve Ashford offered Nolan the position of Vice President of Safety and Integrity, and Nolan said that he would take it under 4 specific conditions. The certification division would report to him with full independence from the business development structure. Employees would have a protected mechanism to report irregularities without consequence to their standing. The company's public communications about the investigation would be factual and complete rather than strategically framed, and his name would not appear in any advertisement, endorsement, or recruiting material. Genevieve agreed to all 4 conditions, and Nolan began the following Monday. Marlene kept the diner. The community surrounding her organized a cooperative fund to acquire the building, not as a favor to anyone in particular, but because it was a place that had existed for 22 years and had earned the right to continue existing, and that was sufficient reason. The fund was structured so that Marlene remained the operator, and the community became the owner, and everyone involved felt that this was approximately how things should work. Preston Whitmore, Logan Price, and Ethan Cole completed community service hours at a Veterans Employment Assistance Center, made direct financial restitution to Clara and to Dorsey's Diner, and issued public statements written without assistance and reviewed only for factual accuracy. Nolan did not advocate for leniency and did not advocate for severity. He told Evelyn that the appropriate response to what they had done was a process that took them seriously enough to hold them accountable, which was more respect than dismissal would have been. Hadley came to her father's new office on his 3rd week there and found it nearly empty. No citations on the wall, no photographs of ceremonies, the field journal locked in a drawer and not on display. On one wall, Marlene had sent a framed object, the tray from the diner, cleaned and mounted, with a small card attached that read, "The day a man refused to let humiliation decide who he was." Hadley stood in front of it for a long time before she said that she was proud of him, and that she had always been proud of him, and that it had occasionally been difficult to be proud of someone who made it so hard for anyone to know what they were proud of. A year later, the veterans gathered again at Dorsey's Diner, and this time there were no cameras, no ceremony, no prepared remarks of any kind. Nolan sat at the same booth by the window he had occupied on the morning when everything began, and his friends sat around him, and when Silas raised a glass and suggested they stand to acknowledge the legend among them, Nolan shook his head with the patient firmness of a man who has made this particular point before. He said, "I didn't bring anyone home so that one day they would have to stand in front of me. I did it so that we could sit down together like this." Outside, Preston was helping Marlene carry supply boxes from a delivery truck, and when he passed the window he found Nolan at the table and gave a small, deliberate nod. Not the nod of a boy trying to make an impression, but of a young man who had spent a year building the understanding that respect is not declared, it is demonstrated. The men who had laughed when a tray hit the floor had called Nolan's silence weakness, but the 20 Marines who walked through that door had always known the truth. The most powerful person in any room is the one who has nothing left to prove.